OK, now let me show you the next steps. So I have this ball, and the ball is supposed to fall down. And I need to extend my timeline in order for it to be able to hit these things here. So I will go to my timeline, just me doing, and set this to something like 1000 frames, extend the preview time. And now I can play this back, see how the ball rolls, and it falls down. So what do I need to do in order for it to hit the floor? Add a collider body to the floor. So go to the floor, simulation tags, collider body. OK, going back to the beginning, playing it back, and see what happens now. It plays back, rolls, and then it hits something. But it doesn't really hit exactly where I want it to. So maybe I want to adjust the path of where the ball rolls, because I can see it doesn't roll straight. It goes a little bit to the side because of the rotation that it's getting. So I might want to create something that forces it to stay in line. To do so, I can just create cubes. So here, maybe I make this one a little bit thinner, a little bit less high, something like this. And I place it right next to where it comes out, something like here. Then I need a second one, so I move it exactly to the other side. So this way, I can force it to stay kind of in line. Then I can adjust the position of what in order to move my clones to the side. What do I move in order to make my clones sit in the middle? The spline. I can't move the cloner, because the cloner sits somewhere, and then it clones it onto the spline. So I have to move the spline. So I select it, and I just move it around, making sure that I only move it on the floor like this. Looks about right. So now these ones here obviously need to be dynamic as well. I have two options. Either I tell each clone individually to be dynamic. So I go here, simulation tags, rigid body. Or I move it up here, and on the cloner, I tell it under collision that the individual elements should be top level.
What's the difference between top and second level?
Top level, second level. So if they have children, but for some reason they should be separate, then you would do top level and second level. Or isn't there also an all level or something? I don't know. Yeah, then it's all, exactly. So first child, and then kind of like the grandchild. Alrighty, so now that I have this, and this is keeping it in line, I need to make sure that these cubes here are also keeping it in line. So I will go to a null object, and I apply them both to a null. Then I can tell the null that this should be a collider body. Here, however, this is only applied to the null, so nothing really happens. If I want it to be applied to the children, I have to use the inherit tab. For clones, it's individual elements. For other elements, it's the inherit tag, where we tell it to be applied to the children.
If we're using a null.
If we're using a null or something else where the children should be affected as well. So now, going back to the beginning of the timeline, playing it back, tip, 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 rolling down, going through here, staying in line, and then it's hitting everything. OK, so pretty much there. I now just need the thing that pushes it, so only the top one gets it, and then they fall down in a regular way how we want it to. But let's get to this point together. Let's start by adding our geometry here on the side, and let's add the dynamic tags towards the end. So let's start with the rail that we want to build. For this, we just create another cube. Make sure that you are in the model mode. Then you can hover over the hotspots and make it overall a little bit smaller, something like this. It's fine if it intersects with the floor. We don't see it later on anyways. Maybe make it a little bit longer. and we want it to be on both sides of the exit of the slide. Next, we want to move our spline a little bit around so that it fits better to the exit of the rails. So we select the helix. Maybe we even go to the top view, because from here we can clearly see where it's supposed to be, and we don't have to worry about which axis we click on. We can just click in an empty area and drag this around until it's nicely aligned with the exit here. So far, so good. Next, we can add our dynamics. First, we want to add dynamics to the floor. So we right-click on it, go to Simulation Tags, and give it a collider body. Then the cubes, I already know that there will be a third cube, so I want them all to be applied or affected by the same tag. To do so, we create a null object and drop the cubes inside. Then you right-click on the null, go to Simulation Tags, and choose the collider body. For this to work, we have to tell the collider body that it should be applied to the children as well. So on the collider body, we will go to the collision and change the inherit tag from none to apply tag to children.
Does it apply the tag to the parent as well? Does it apply the tag to the parent as well?
Yes, we will apply to the parent as well as to the children. Then we want to apply the tag to the cloner. So we right-click on the cloner, go to Simulation Tags, and we choose the rigid body. Now by default, this would now be detected as one big thing that belongs together. So these clones would act as one large object and not as individual small objects. Just to take a quick look at what this results in, so if I now play this back, oh, it's too short. Sorry, let's also extend the timeline here real quick. So 1000 frames for the entire length, and don't forget to extend the preview time. All right. So this plays back, and then it's pushed against the entire thing, and then it pushes the entire thing backwards as if they are glued together with invisibility. Make sure that you increase the preview time as well. So on the cloner, we select it, and under inherit tag, we choose the individual elements to be top level. If we now play it back, we should get something like this. So far, so good? Yeah. Alrighty. Next, we want to make sure that all of them are falling down in the way that we want to. So right now, the first one does not fall down the way that we want it to, because it's hit from the bottom. And the sphere is just like pushing all sorts of things down. And that's why the whole simulation here is just a whole mess and not really what we want. Yeah. So that is why I thought of this additional element that we see here, where the sphere can push against it, and that is then the thing that with its nose pushes only the top, and it cannot go further than a specific area. So that element was not a design element, it was more of a necessity to have something where it can push it forward. Alrighty, so I will do the steps first, afterwards we do them together. I need another collider here. For that, I will just use another cube. I rotate it around by 90 degrees, place it where I think it should be, and I make it a little bit less wide. Something like this. Doesn't have to fit in there perfectly. For now, this is good enough. Then I need my element that can push my dominoes here in the top. For this, I will use another cube, but this time I drag it outside of the null object. Then I can move it to the side. I can make it a little bit less wide. Oops, a little bit thicker like this. And maybe I move it upwards so I can see what the general height is. So maybe less high, something like that. Making sure that it doesn't intersect with the floor, so just sit above it. Something like this. Looks about right. Then I make this editable. I can use the extrude tool to extrude a little part upwards. So I hit D, make sure that the caps option is off, and extrude it outwards. And here, I extrude it out as well, like this. If I want to, I could select all the top polygons and move them even higher, like this. Oops. Like this, and I can move it to an appropriate spot. Alrighty. Maybe I also make everything a little bit wider, so I select all the polygons and stretch them until it feels like it's nicely in there. Okay. Now, is this going to be a collider or a rigid body? A rigid body, because if it's a collider, the sphere would just hit it and it would not move. So I right-click on the cube, go to Simulation Tags, and I will make it a rigid body. Will this work? Probably not. And what is the reason? I can already tell you this will a little bit explode.
Because you need to change the position to more automatic, more dynamic.
Remember the shrink wrap? And we have a convex or concave shape here, one of the two. So the collision shape goes down here and it intersects with the wall. So if I now play this back, it's being pushed back. Because it is intersecting, then it's pushed out, and due to this motion, it is pushed back even further. So to not have this happen, we need to go to the collision and change the shape to more automatic. And see, apparently here, it wasn't smart enough. So we have to try another thing. Let's go through them. Box, nah, that's even worse. Ellipsoid, nah, doesn't really make sense. Cylinder, not. Maybe it's convex. I'm not sure, it could be. Nope, apparently still not working. So what else do we have? We have moving mesh, static mesh, or another mesh. Static mesh is essentially telling it to be a collider body. So if I now play back, nothing is happening. But if I tell it to be a moving mesh, then it's OK, and it's being hit. It's too short! Oh, it's just too short! Damn it! So close! So close! OK, so let's take the helix and move it very close to it. Let's try this again. Oh. No, no, it's okay. No, it's okay. Ah. Yay! Alrighty. Let's do this now together. Okay, so we want to first create an additional wall down here. For this, we duplicate one of the cubes that we have inside of the null that is for the rail. We duplicate it and make sure that it's still inside of the null so it gets the same collider. Then we can just rotate it around, place it kind of where it needs to be, and adjust the size. Sometimes it's easier to look at it when we go to the rotating with lines, because we can see where geometry ends and starts a little bit better. All right. Good. Now, we can take the same cube that we just created and make another copy of it. Hold down Command or Control and drag it outside of the null object. Then we move it a little bit to the back, make it less wide, a little bit longer, less high so that it sits onto the floor, just eyeballing it and making it fit as good as possible and pushing it backwards so that it has some possibility to be pushed forward. If you want to, you can also enable the screen space AO. So this one here, SSAO, it's called, Screen Space Ambient Occlusion, and you can find it under Options. And this just adds a little bit of a fake shadowing around our object, which sometimes makes it easier to distinguish objects from one another. So far, so good?
Does it matter if it's stuck in the floor?
Yes. It should be just a little bit above the floor. If it intersects, it will be pushed out. Then we can make it editable by hitting the letter C. Now that we have it as a polygon, we can go to the polygon mode, select the top polygon, and extrude it outwards. We hit D. We make sure that the Create Caps option is turned off. And then we extrude it outwards. Then we can select the polygon in the front. Create Caps.
After we select the top of it,
Hit D for the extrude. Make sure the Create Caps option is turned off. D for the extrude. And then we extrude it once up and then once to the side here.
If I want to move the helix
remove the helix. So, what do you do if suddenly this happens? So suddenly, all my objects are there, but so if this happens, then there's a shortcut, I think, that can do this accidentally. But you had an object selected, you went to View, and you choose Set as Root. And this will then make sure that the hierarchy only shows the children of the element that you have selected. The object that I had selected did not have children, so I don't see anything. You can just say, go to main level, and then all the objects come back. So they are not gone, you were just looking into another object. All right. Now, this collider here should be its own dynamics tag, and it should not be a collider, but a rigid body. So we take the cube.2, in my case it's called this way, we right-click on it, go to Simulation Tags, and we choose the collider body. Then we go down to the collision, and the shape is supposed to be moving mesh. So if all fails, moving mesh is always the last resort. This will give you the most accurate solve, but it will also take the longest to calculate.
Can you make this a collider body?
Oh, sorry, yeah, no, yeah, yeah, obviously not, sorry. Rigid body, and then the shape is supposed to be moving mesh. And when we now play this back, it should work the way that we expect it to. Poof. Alrighty. Alrighty. Let me talk briefly about the 4 main things that you can change with cloners. 5. Thing number 1. We can define how heavy something is. So maybe this animation looks a little bit weird. When it hits it down here, it feels like it's too light, almost as if it's hollow. The sphere hits it, and it's just very quickly that it's being pushed. We can select the tag of our cube that we have here, and we can go to the mass. And we want to give it a custom mass. So we say custom mass here, and I could say, for instance, that this should be 1000% instead of 100%. If I now go back to the beginning and I play this back, everything looks normal. It falls down. And now I can see it is being pushed against it, but this is now way too heavy for the sphere to be hit. So maybe I would rather go to something like 200, 300%, so that the sphere can still push it, but it doesn't move too lightly. This is option number 1. Option number 2, 3, and 4 are the bounce, the friction, and the collision noise. Although the collision noise is kind of like a half thing. Let me show you this in a quick other example. If I have a sphere here, and oops, come on, I'm not hitting right. There we go. Jab, jab, jab. And another sphere here. Both of them get the dynamics tab, the rigid body, and I have a floor being a collider. So when I play this back, they're doing a little bit of a bounce. This bounce is defined by these options here. So here we have bounce, friction, and collision noise. Bounce means if I set this to 100%, it would, I think, never stop bouncing. If I also tell the floor to be bouncy, 100%. At least it bounces a little bit longer. Apparently there's still some friction in the air that makes it stop sooner or later. So we can see if the floor has some bounce and the sphere has some bounce, it bounces stronger. The friction defines how smooth is the surface. So in our scenario, here we can see that as we hit the bottom part, so let me switch the mass back to 100. and I play this back, they are being pushed and then they lie on the floor and then they glide a lot, which might result into some issues. So here we could try and tell the floor to have a higher friction. So when they land on the floor, they don't glide so much. So on the floor, I would try to go to a friction of 100. Keeping in mind, though, that this element needs to be pushed across the floor as well. So this might now result into some issues. But let's see. So it rolls down, pushes it, and now we can see it has the correct heaviness as it had before, but now it is, yeah, too high of a friction. I could try to tell the floor maybe to be a little bit less, maybe 90%, and therefore I tell the cube here to have way less friction. So here, under collision, maybe I set the friction to 0. So maybe it now glides on the floor a little bit better. But when these are falling down, we can see how they glide for a way shorter time. They hit the floor, they glide on top of each other a little bit, but that's pretty much it. Then we have the collision noise. The collision noise defines what happens with an element that does something that is perfect. For instance, if I have multiple spheres that I stack on top of each other, and I increase the distance between them a little bit, and they all get the same dynamic, I'm blind, the same rigid body tag, and I have a floor that is a collider. Now, in theory, the balls are perfect. They are perfectly aligned, they fall on a perfectly flat surface, which means they should balance on top of each other as if nothing happens. But when I play back, I can see they fall, and then they fall down on the sides. And this is due to the collision noise. So for every collision, it will add a little bit of randomness to imitate how the real world works, because things should not be perfectly aligned. So I think, I haven't tested this in a while, if I select both tags and I tell them to have a collision noise that is 0, and I play it back, they just stand there, which is something that would most likely never happen in reality. So the collision noise just adds a little bit of randomness to how the clones behave if something perfect happens. These were the 4 main ones, and then there's a 5th. The 5th is a little bit hidden. When you hit Command D for the project settings, or go to Edit and Project Settings, we can go to the Dynamics settings. Here we have things like how strong is gravity, or what is our time scale. For the time scale, it's kind of like special, not that necessary. I can briefly show it to you in our example here. So for instance, if I play this back, in the beginning I want my time scale to be 100. Then they are falling down, and maybe from here on out, I want this to be a slow motion. I could hit Command D, go to the time scale, go a couple of frames forward, and then change the time scale to 25%. If I now play this back, everything will behave normally, and then once I reach those keyframes, they will fall down in slow motion. So with this, I can define how quickly does time progress with a nice percentage value here. What I want to talk about, though, is the expert option, because here we can define how many steps per frame I want. Sometimes it might happen that something doesn't come to a rest. It falls down and it just constantly jitters around, which is super annoying. Essentially what's happening is that it intersects with the floor, it's being pushed up, rotated, intersects again, pushed up, rotated, intersects again, pushed up, and so on, and it just never comes to a stop. And this is because Cinema 4D calculates from one frame to the next, and it calculates where the object would go, and afterwards it detects if there should be a collision. But first, it detects how far it should go. So there could be a collision in between these steps. They are, by default, 5 steps in between and 10 steps as the maximum solver iteration per step. If you have issues where things are intersecting or doing weird things, then you can try to set this to a higher value and you get a more realistic result. This, however, also means that instead of creating 5 to 10 substeps, it now creates 50 substeps for every single frame. So the playback that we have here might be overall a little bit slower, so it might not be able to play it back as real time as it did usually. But it also might result in a more realistic result. Here we can see, due to less inaccuracies of the solver, they are now lying on top of each other instead of being pushed to the side due to inaccurate collisions. So generally speaking, doing it, that is super slow motion. So instead of trying to play around with too many other settings, if you feel like the results that you're getting are not realistic enough, Command D, going to the dynamics, expert, and changing the steps per frame to 50, which is usually a good result. When working with dynamics, you should always be careful because Cinema 4D expects things to be around 2 meters in size. If I were to build this in the realistic size, a couple of other settings might need to change. So right now, everything plays back a little bit too slow. You might know when we have dominoes, they fall very, very quickly. And these fall very small, because these are right now 2 meters high. And that is why they are falling almost in slow motion, even in the beginning. So if you want to build realistic dynamics, the scene should be built in a realistic size. But then there are some additional settings that might need to be adjusted so that the dynamics solve correctly. Because if something is too small, then collisions might be detected way too early and weird things are happening. OK, so much for dynamics in Cinema 4D. For a homework, I want you to create something in this area where you just have stuff that creates a chain reaction. Could be something with dominoes, could not be dominoes at all, just other things that are reacting. Maybe the, however it's called. Sure. Seesaw, something like this. We have something fall and something else push. So model a small scene where you can work with some kind of chain reactions of some sorts. Alrighty? In the end, I want to not get the Cinema 4D file. I want you to practice how to render this out without rendering it. Which means, if I want to see this as an end result, as a video file later on, I first figure out how long this is supposed to be. So I let this play back. And I still have the slow motion in there, so let's pretend this is how far I want to go, 230 frames. So I would go and make my entire scene 230 frames long. In order to be able to play it back and forth, I can bake it. For this, I just select one of them. I go to Cache, and I say Bake All. You should only do this after you shorten the scene. Otherwise, it will bake for the entire length, and then it just might take way longer than necessary. Here, I now might already be able to play it back in real time, and I can scrub through and see what is happening. So this is already nice. But even this might not be able to play back inside of Cinema 4D in real time. So we need this as a video. You want to go to the render settings, go to the renderer, and choose the hardware OpenGL. In there, you want to enable Enhance OpenGL, enable SSAO if necessary. If you also use something like reflections or shadows or something like this, you can enable them here as well. And the anti-aliasing should be 8. Now, these settings will then be used if we go to Make Preview, and we don't choose the full render, but the hardware OpenGL. So this is important. Maybe you should watch the screen, then you know what we are doing. So you don't want to choose the full renderer, because then it will use the physical renderer, even if we've set something else up here in the render settings. So this needs to be changed to the hardware OpenGL as well, all frames, and I can give it a size. Maybe you use the 1920 size. Frame rate 25, all is good, and the default settings for the MP4 will be fine. You can then hit OK, and it will calculate the preview down here in the bottom left corner. This should only take a minute, maybe only a few seconds and not much longer. If it takes much longer, then you probably are still on the full render. After it's done, I can see how I have it here in the timeline as a video file, and I can also find the video file by right-clicking on it and saying Show File in Explorer. It is then in some weird temporary folder where you don't want it to be. So you can just copy it, put it on the desktop. There I already have another preview, which I don't want to delete. Can I say, no, can I keep both? No, doesn't matter. You just copy it to some other place, and here we have the actual video file that we can then play back in real time, and this is the file that I want to get. Alrighty? Awesome. And in our next class, we will then explore a little bit what we can do with camera animations. And that's it.